Okay, this is a discussion on a number of areas: language, intelligence, and personality. It's going to be a more extended lecture. We're going to finish the book, chapter 7, and go beyond the book with regard to personality. Key terms are online as well, which should assist you in this process. Language, in terms of language acquisition, is influenced by both learning and inborn features, biological features. A key name in language development is Noam Chomsky, Chomsky. He articulated that the ability to learn a language is at least partially biological or innate, native at birth. And there are basically two components to this, what's known as a nativist perspective, as outlined by Chomsky. One being the critical or sensitive period for language, in which there is an opportunity, a window, if you will, in which language is learned most easily from infancy through around puberty, but especially the first 4 or 5 years of life. The second model, also connected to Chomsky, is referred to as universal grammar. And that language, the essential feature here is that, and premise is that language is learned in a particular order or sequence and is cross-cultural, is universal. So that you're not generally speaking in sentences first. There's babbling, which are the first sounds at around 6 months, one word at about a year, two-word combinations at 2 years, and sentences at around 3 to 4 years. This is not to say environment doesn't come into play. It certainly does. And a more enriching, more stimulating environment facilitates language development. And language has a key connection to intelligence, and we'll talk about intelligence. There are multiple, let's do that. There are multiple intelligences. We're going to focus on cognitive and social intelligence. Cognitive intelligence is more school-related. Social is your ability to not only understand yourself, but others, make good decisions. A name associated with social intelligence is Robert Sternberg, who feels and contends that social intelligence is at least as significant or critical as cognitive intelligence. IQ tests are measures theoretically of one's ability to learn, but really what they probably measure is what you've been exposed to at least as much as your ability to learn. And the tests tend to look at a couple of areas, including your verbal and nonverbal intelligence. Verbal has to do with vocabulary, general knowledge. Nonverbal deals with reasoning that is not associated with language, such as identifying a picture, something missing from a picture, or sequencing of pictures, or matching geometric blocks to match geometric design. These are considered more nonverbal and probably more inborn characteristics. The most common IQ test is called the Wechsler Tests of Intelligence. There are 3 versions: a preschool, a school age, and an adult version. The most commonly employed of those 3 is the school age, from 6 to 16. Another commonly used IQ test, the second most commonly used test, is the Stanford-Binet. And though the score has some significance, we'll talk about scores in just a minute, the IQ test, such as the Wechsler, is more to give a sense of how people learn and process, and to establish some perspective on how people learn. For example, if you have a learning disability, it's a little bit of a misnomer. It doesn't mean you have a disability that is global. It is some impediment in some area of functioning, like reading. Dyslexia actually is the most common learning disability in an otherwise bright person. There are even gifted learning disabled people who don't function particularly well in school, are probably average students, but have high IQs. But there are some areas, even on an IQ test, that are far better than others. This is called scatter. There's a lot of up and down, and that's true of a learning disability. These tests, these IQ tests that look at learning disabilities, have issues with validity, measuring. Are they accurately measuring intelligence? Well, they're moderately valid at best. They're only fairly good at looking at your innate ability. Certainly a lot of environmental factors such as exposure and schooling come into play. The tests, though, tend to be reliable. That is, they tend to give you a consistent result. So what is the result what does it mean in terms of numeric or a metric? Well, the average IQ is 100, whether it be on the Wechsler or the Stanford Binet. In terms of the Wechsler, 68% of people fall between 85 and 115. On the Binet, I think it's 68% between 84 and 116. And the score, again, doesn't really tell you a whole lot, unless it's at an extreme, very low. The bottom 2% is considered intellectually disabled, top 2% gifted. A gifted IQ would be 130 or better. A intellectually disabled IQ, less than 70. And there have been studies of high IQ people. For example, a very classic study which looked at intelligence over a lifetime and its impact on vocational and health functioning and health and many aspects of one's life, and not just individually but a group of people. That study is referred to as the Terman study, Terman, and it looked at top 2%ers and how they did not only as children but as young adults, middle-aged adults, and beyond, and found that for the most part they were doing better. They were making more money, were more highly educated, but they did have a high rate of suicidality. So there is a complexity to IQ, what it may represent. Longevity is associated, ironically, with IQ, that high IQ people tend to live longer, even though there is a high rate of suicidality. It may be that you just have a higher income and education level, and that helps longevity in terms of better medical care, jobs that are maybe less dangerous, and so on. Your number of years of school is actually a good predictor of your IQ, telling you it has a lot to do with education and exposure than innate or inborn intelligence. One study that really speaks to this in terms of exposure and environment is referred to as is connected to Project Head Start. The actual name of the study was called the Milwaukee Project, and it looked at kids. This is going back to the 1970s. In very low-income education areas of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. SES is your socioeconomic status. It's based on your income and your education. If you're a child, your parents' income and education. And in this study, these were kids coming from low-income and education backgrounds, and they tested very poorly at IQ as a group. The average IQ, I think, was something like 75, which is considered borderline mentally retarded. But when they were in these programs, they not only scored higher on IQ, they scored significantly higher. The IQ jumped from the average of the group went from a 75 to a 105, telling you that there's some benefit certainly to preschool education, but also that there are issues with validity with regard to IQ testing. Creativity, by the way, here's another flaw or fly in the ointment, if you will, with regard to IQ, and that is things like creativity are really not looked at. You can be highly creative and probably have a good IQ, but you may not test as a genius. And IQ is one of those things we've talked about traits that is influenced by nature and nurture. Now, the general rule of nature-nurture, as we've talked about already this semester, is about a 50-50 contribution in terms of your nature, your biology, and your nurture, your environment. There is a school of thought, and your book is one of those schools of thought in terms of the research they point to, which suggests that IQ may be maybe even significantly more than 50% nature. I think they went as high as 0.86. I think there is some debate about this, but it's at least 50%, if not more, nature. Okay, we're going to switch gears and talk about personality. Now we're going outside the book. The concept of personality assumes a relative consistency in behavior over time and across situations. Relative consistency in behavior over time and across situations. And the fact is, based on current research, there's evidence that if we're consistent 50% of the time, that's a high number, a high percentage, probably more like 20, 30, 40%. If you're an honest person, maybe you're honest 40% of the time. It would be very rare you'd be honest 90%. Going back about 100 years, Freud is a name associated with a number of things. He's the pioneer of psychoanalysis. He also was a personality theorist, and he speculated that people have three structures what he called three structures of the mind that dictate and influence personality. Something called the ID, which I think we may have referenced before, has to do with sort of biological drives. The opposite of id is the superego. This is dealing with guilt and conscience and your internalization of societal mores. Now, how do you resolve the issue of an id that wants something and a superego is going to make you feel guilty? Well, there's a structure called the ego, which is the negotiator between the two, and tries to meet the needs of both. So, if you work hard and you're able to buy food that you want, you're getting your id needs met without feeling overly guilty. Freud was a stage theorist. We're going to talk about a couple of stage theorists here, Freud being one of them. And he talked about 5 stages of what he referred to as psychosexual development, which basically establishes your personality by around age 5. He speculated, and by the way, much of this is not supported by research, so this is theory that is not empirically supported in a contemporary sense. He theorized that there are basically a couple of different stages that occur before age 5. The first one being in infancy, the oral stage. The second, where the focus is on the mouth and nursing and eating and survival, nourishment. The second stage, around age 2, the anal stage, dealing with toilet training. And around 3 to 5, the stage is referred to as the phallic stage, and it connects to young children having feelings toward their opposite sex parents, which are romantic and sexual. But just to back up a little bit, according to Freud, these are unconscious processes. We're not aware of these. And Freud says, with regard to the phallic stage, this is where it gets a little dicey. The little boy is romantically interested in his mother, but if his father or a male figure finds out, he may be in trouble. Not only punished, but maybe he gets mutilated, castrated. And so the little boy, afraid of this, identifies with the father and says, I want to be just like you. This conflict is often referred to as the Oedipus complex. The little girl, according to Freud, has a feeling toward her father, but she's not as threatened because she doesn't have the same genitalia, and it's not quite as stressful or as conflictual, or you're not as conflicted or as anxiety. The anxiety is not as provoking as it would be for a little boy. I should also add, there is a term that Freud uses called fixation. If you get too little or too much of something, particularly with regard to the oral anal stage. So if a child is undernourished or overnourished, literally, they may start developing, in the oral stage, they may start developing signs of this in adolescence or adulthood. They start to eat too much, too little, chew their nails, do whatever they are, drink alcohol or drink some other substance. No real support for this, but it's an interesting idea. Anal stage, if you get too much or too little, maybe you're overly neat or sloppy as an adult. So we've talked about those first 3 stages of Freud's stages of psychosexual development. Stage 4 is something he calls latency, latency, where there is the child sort of becomes desexualized. There's not a real interest in sexuality, but a focus rather on socialization, i.e. school. But around 12 or 10 or 11 or 12, when puberty strikes, that there are obviously hormonal influences, and if there was fixation earlier or whatever issues earlier occur in life, they start to display themselves here. Freud went on to add, separate from this 5-stage model of personality development and the psychosexual stages, that we have these issues in our lives, and we are largely unaware of them because there is this sort of overriding unconscious. But sometimes we sort of have to sort of keep this unconscious stuff at rest, at bay. And so we use these defense mechanisms to do that. For example, denial. It just didn't happen. That's, according to Freud, the most primitive defense mechanism. He also added the most sophisticated defense mechanism is called rationalization, where we justify something. I'm glad I didn't take that job. That would have taken me away from home. I don't care about the extra money. Freud argued that many times with anger, we don't express it toward the person or object we want to, but rather towards something more less threatening. So you're angry at your boss, but you kick the can on the street. That's displacement. Another defense mechanism is you don't like something about yourself, you attribute it to someone else. He or she's a crook or a thief. That's projection. Freud was a pessimist, a cynic, and he thought if people work very hard, it probably has something to do with rechanneling of sexual energy. The name for this, sublimation. And if you have a very strong impulse, according to Freud, that is aggressive or sexual, you'll often defend against it by doing the opposite. So maybe you have a very aggressive person who becomes a peace activist because they're trying to ward off that aggression. This is, again, reaction formation. Continuing with Freud, Freud is not only the father of psychoanalysis, he develops this method of therapy called psychoanalysis, in which the unconscious can be brought to the conscious level, and you can understand a person and help make them change, help them create change through insight and awareness. And he said there are techniques to do this. You can interpret their dreams, dream interpretation. Present a word, they say the next word that comes to mind. This is called free association. Analyze a slip of the tongue, sometimes now called Freudian slips. I want to kill you, I mean call you. Well, that's a Freudian slip. And analyze the resistance, which is part of therapy or analysis, that they'll miss appointments and they'll show up late, and this is part of the analysis and the bringing the unconscious to the conscious level, and that awareness and that recognition that these are ways of sort of gaining that connection between the unconscious and the conscious world. We're going to move on from Freud and talk about someone who's considered a neo-Freudian, someone who was influenced by Freud but went sort of a different direction. And this person's name is Erik Erikson. He developed something called the stages, or 8 stages, of not sexual, but psychosocial development. And it was his view that we continue to evolve our personalities throughout the lifespan. Now, these models, Freud, Erikson's, and the next person, Kohlberg, we're going to talk about, are really large, pretty much all environmental. They're not biological at all. So with Erikson, he says there are 8 stages, and it's very much tied into childhood and adolescence. And although it does go into adulthood. And with each stage, there's an associated what he calls psychosocial crisis. This is something that we try to resolve, and if we resolve it successfully, it helps our personality grow and develop. And if we don't, it may inhibit us and impair us in some ways. But we can go back to it later on in life. It just becomes more difficult. So let's talk about each of these. The first stage is infancy, and the psychosocial crisis is: are you going to trust, or you're not going to trust? Mistrust. At 2 years of age, the crisis is autonomy. Are you going to sort of go out in the world, or at least a little bit out in the world, in your backyard or in your house, and be autonomous? Or if you don't do that, you're going to feel shame and doubt. From 3 to 5 years of age, that's the stage. The crisis is in taking the initiative, or if you don't do that, you're going to feel guilty. So a little kid who feels mistrustful, shame and doubt and guilt is not doing so well. But it doesn't mean that's it for life. From 6 to 11 years of age, they experience something either referred to as, this is the crisis, industry, a sense of competence, or inferiority. So maybe you have a child who's struggled at home in a difficult family situation, goes to school and is successful, and they're feeling a sense of industry or competence. From 12 to 20, identity, a sense of who one is and where they're going, it becomes part of one's development. And the crisis is identity. If you can achieve that, figure out what you're going to do, or you're going to be confused, role confusion. This is viewed as a bit antiquated, that identity is usually not established at age 14. But this is an older model going back to the 1930s. And in those days, people would marry much younger and establish a vocation in their teens. So it's a bit it's a little bit affected by the times. That one doesn't hold up as well. From 20 to 40, according to Erikson, your crisis is: are you going to be intimate with others, friends, and romantically, or are you going to feel isolated? From 40 to 65, so he calls it intimacy versus isolation. From 40 to 65, the psychosocial crisis is referred to as generativity, giving back to the next generation. Or if you don't, that's positive resolution. Or if you don't achieve it, you're going to feel stagnated. The idea that at a certain point you've been given something, hopefully, and giving back is going to facilitate your growth. That if you teach or mentor or supervise or a parent or grandparent or you name it, that's good in terms of personality development. At a certain point in your mid-60s, maybe even beyond that, but this is going back 90 years, 65 plus, you're going to feel a sense of integrity and meaning. He calls this ego integrity, or you're going to feel despair if you feel your life has not been worthwhile. These are stage theorists that are rather binary. There is a lot of gray area. It's also the last stage. If people live to 100, maybe one could argue you could break that down into many stages because 65 to 100 is a third of the lifespan. Those later stages are getting rather broad. Finally, the last stage theorist is associated with Lawrence Kohlberg, a developmental psychologist at Harvard in the 1960s, and he was interested in moral reasoning. And he said that basically most people, when they're very young, are at the most elementary level of moral reasoning. He calls this pre-conventional moral reasoning. That your decisions are based on, can I get away with it? Can I take that cookie out of the cookie jar? Consequences are really the key here. But by the time you're 8, 9, 10 years of age, you're probably going to go along with the social conventions because you're sort of told that's the thing to do. Kohlberg refers to this as conventional moral reasoning. He also adds that starting in adolescence or young adulthood, for some people, not many, but some, they don't just adhere to social norms. They evaluate the rightness or wrongness of something. They can actually think in a very abstract way and be able to assess the morality of something. And if you're able to achieve this, that's sort of a rare thing, that if your moral decisions are based on individual assessment, not for self, but for society, really. So there's a collective component here. If you can get there, that's the highest level of moral reasoning. That's called post-conventional moral reasoning. Two more models that are, that are 70 years old or greater, probably, 1960s or before. One of them is one we talked about, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Remember, there are 5 levels to this, the highest being self-actualization. The bottom level are physiological needs like water and food. The next level, safety, such as a roof over your head. The third level, love and belonging, also referred to as affiliation. The fourth level, achievement, like work. And most people never get to the highest level. This is, again, called self-actualization. Really ties in with self-fulfillment. Expressing yourself in a way that is uniquely you, feeling good about yourself, having a good sense of identity, having intimacy in your life, but also being autonomous. There aren't too many people who can achieve all this, but it can be done. You obviously need to have your foundational needs met. Finally, there's Carl Rogers, who talked about people's need to be regarded, to be affirmed. He calls this positive regard, and says there are 2 types of positive regard. The more desirable one is unconditional, that someone in your life loves you, and it's really irrespective of how much money you have or anything about you other than being you. But the reality is, so many relationships have contingencies or conditional. That if you're sort of meeting the needs of someone else, what they want from you, they'll accept you more and regard you more than if you don't. Well, this is called conditional positive regard. Okay, finally, we're going to talk about some more streamlined models that are all post-World War II models. And they're not stage theorists, although the stage theorists ended with Kohlberg. Okay, here's one. Walter Mischel, Mischel. He talked about something called the person-situation interaction. That it's not just your disposition or person that determines what happens in your life or your behavior or your situation. It's both, and how they interact. So if you're an outgoing person, for example, and you're working in a sales job, that might be a good interaction. He calls that a goodness of fit. But if you're an outgoing person and you're working in a cubicle or you're working at home and you're bored and it's very asocial, that's not a good fit. That's a lack of goodness of fit. That's essentially the Mischel model. Remember Albert Bandura and social learning theory? Well, we're introduced to Albert Bandura again, and he comes up with an interesting construct. It's called self-efficacy, our sense of competence. And he says this is important, but it's not consistent. We may feel competent in one thing, but not in another. So you may be an excellent math student, but not a great foreign language person. So you're high in self-efficacy in one, lower in another. And this self-efficacy or sense of competence has to do with your comparison to others, the feedback you get from other people, your body, if you're feeling comfortable, that increases self-efficacy. And it's not one and the same with self-esteem, but it's correlated. So if you have high self-efficacy, you tend to have high self-esteem. Moving along, how about the name Julian Rotter? A name like Rotter, it's got to be good. Rotter. And he refers to something called locus of control. And that is, if we can feel control of our world, we feel that our behavior determines outcomes. That's called internal locus of control, or specifically high internal locus of control. If, though, you feel like whatever you do doesn't determine outcomes, and sort of the world, luck and happenstance are doing that, that's referred to as external locus of control, or high external locus of control. And that's actually associated with depression and anxiety. Lastly, we have the ocean model. Now, this is an acronym. This is a mnemonic rather for remembering it, and it basically has to do with 5 characteristics that that they have looked at and synthesized traits into. That there are 5 specific traits. If you I think there are like 100 traits or 96 traits, and they narrow down to 5. Sometimes they call this the Big Five. I think Raymond Cattell was the name here, but just to know the Big Five or the ocean model is enough for this exam. And so here are the basic traits. Openness, which has to do with open to new ideas. That's the O. Conscientiousness, C, being disciplined, being hardworking, conscientiousness. E, extroversion, outgoing. A, agreeableness, friendly. And the only negative trait, which is so interesting, because psychology definitely leans toward the negative, but this model does not. And it's referred to as neuroticism. And this has to do with anxiety, high neuroticism. So actually, it's interesting. You would think that psychologists and therapists will say, well, that person's low in N, high in E, and high in O, and low in C. And it generally is not, information is not communicated this way. But this is the ocean model, or the Big Five. So anyway, those are the key. We've gone through language, to intelligence, to personality. You should know your terms cold. The terms are online. And it should be of help, certainly in terms of exam 3. You'll see this material, and you'll also see it on exam 4 to follow shortly after exam 3. Okay, take care.